Uditi, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay.
We want to repeat again.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's very nice to see some of you coming back again for our sessions. It's always nice to see familiar faces. Thanks for coming back. We'll just wait for maybe around 2 more minutes for a few more people to join us, and then we will kickstart the session. But I've put some resources in the chat for those who have joined us. So one is on our upcoming webinar that is Getting Compensation Right, that will be on 15th of June. And I've put the link for the registration if you want in the chat. As well as we do have an upcoming one-day Employment Act course that we are running next month. So if you're interested, do join us. And one more thing, actually we have some new initiatives for HR that are coming up. One is the guidebook on employment contract, leading practices that we have. So this will be coming very soon. And the next is free HR clinic sessions that we are conducting. So these will be 1-hour sessions conducted by Maurice here.
And I will elaborate a little bit further on this too towards the end of the session.
Yeah. So I've put, you can stay tuned to these initiatives by following our LinkedIn page and commenting on the posts that there are there for these two initiatives. I think we'll just wait maybe 1 more minute and then we'll kickstart the session.
And for those who are present now, if you do not have a calculator with you, I suggest that you get hold of one. If not, you can always use your calculator on your mobile phone. We do have some exercise towards the end of this session on calculating of salaries.
Okay, so we've waited 2 minutes. I think it's time for us to start the session. So good afternoon, everyone again. Hope you have been having a good day. So this is our 4th webinar on the foundational HR webinars that we are conducting. This webinar series was for you to become a HR business partner. Today's session is on managing payroll correctly, and just some housekeeping before we get started. So as you can see, this webinar is recorded, but not to worry, it is your information is confidential. Only the video is shared on our YouTube page. And if you actually want to see the previous webinars, you can also refer to our YouTube page. For any questions that you have, do type them in the Q&A box that you see by this orange arrow. If you have any questions you want to ask verbally, do also raise your hand and we'll give you permission to talk. We are launching poll questions throughout the session as well to make it more interactive and to understand you better. There are some calculations that Maurice will be going through later as well, and you can actually answer through the poll as well. There will be a survey at the end of the session. And of course, for those who are attending this webinar, you're eligible for HR consulting session. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Maurice, our HR consultant. Over to you, Maurice.
Thank you, Uditi. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. Before I jump into my presentation, as usual, let me introduce myself for those participants who are joining us for the first time. Now, I'm currently a HR consultant with New Vista Technologies, and I was a HR practitioner for more than 38 years. I used to be a HR director before I became a HR consultant. I have worked as a journalist covering all spectrum of HR, as well as the region, Asia Pacific region. So I'm very hands-on as well as very strategic in the HR function. Now, today we are going to talk about Payroll, this is something that some HR may have to do. In some companies, payroll falls under finance. We're going to talk a little bit about what a payroll person needs to know, the kind of regulation, something about calculation of salaries, payments and deductions, pay slips, submission, payroll system, and how NuVista can help you. Before I start my seminar, a little bit about NuVista and NuSmart. NuVista was established in 2002. It's a leading provider of cloud-based integrated IT solution and has been a NetSuite partner since 2012. And in 2015, they started NuSmart as a HRMS provider, HR management system, and in using NetSuite platform. Today, they have implemented more than 30 customers across 10 countries. NuSmart HRMS covers the full spectrum of HR, ranging from recruitment and onboarding to payroll, attendance, leave management, training, assets and loan, performance management, travel expense. Our system is available on both web portal as well as mobile application, iOS and Android, and also on tablets. Besides providing HRMS, NuVista also do HR consulting and payroll outsourcing and HR outsourcing. So now let us get started with our webinar. As a payroll, there are areas of the law that you need to understand. And some of these are the Employment Act, Part-Time Employment Regulation, Child Development Co-Saving Act, CPF, Income Tax Act, and NuSmart Act. The last few, you may not need to know the whole act, but certain parts such as the contribution rate, what are the things that are subjected to CPF or income tax and so forth. So it is important that for a payroll person read out on all these legal statutory regulation. Now, as employees works for employer, for the company, so it is the company responsibility to make sure that employees are paid salaries. If there's allowance, it should be paid as well together with the salary. If there's any deduction that needs to be made, then the company has to deduct. There's also contribution compulsory that companies has to make and also submit it to the relevant authority. So these are some of the obligations of the company. Now, let's have a quick exercise. There will be a poll now to see whether you know. So for the first case, employer pays an employee a gross salary of $2,500 per month, inclusive of overtime, and asks the employees to work 10 hours for 6 days. Is this correct or incorrect? And then the second question, employer pays $1,500 to a foreign worker and deduct $500 for accommodation allowance. It is correct or incorrect? What do you all think? Let's have a quick poll. Just want to gauge your knowledge on payroll and how much you understand about the Employment Act. So first question is a little bit tricky. Companies pays an employee a lump sum, $2,500 per month, and says that you have to work 10 hours for 6 days. Can companies do that? Is it right under the law, Employment Act? Question. Second question is, employer pay 1,500 to a foreign worker and they then deduct 500 for accommodation. So this is a very common situation where they provide dormitories to foreign worker and they will deduct 500. So do you think these two, are they correct or incorrect statement? Let's see the result if you have finished. How many things is correct and how many things is incorrect? Wow, okay. Most of you got the answer correct. All right. It is both incorrect. Okay. Because 10 hours a day you count by 6 days, okay, it's more than 44 hours. So therefore, it is against the law. And for the accommodation deduction, the maximum limit is 25%. 500 is more than 25. So this is against, not allowed by the law. So most of you have got good understanding of the law. For those who got it wrong, don't worry. Do read up the Employment Act. Take some time to explore and read about it. You can find it on the MOM website, or you can go to the Singapore Statute portal. Okay, a little bit about calculation. Okay, when we do payroll, of course, nowadays, everything is done by the system. All right, you just put in the number of days works, the number of days absent, and the system will calculate for you automatically. But is the system correct? We need to check. Because garbage in, garbage out. So whatever formula you have put into the system, sometimes it could be wrong. So for incomplete month, we always use the gross rate of pay. And the formula, according to the Employment Act, is the monthly gross salary divided by the number of working days in that month times the number of days the employee worked in that month. This formula is very common and is used for an employee who joined in between the month or resigned in between the month or has taken some no pay leave during the month and so forth. So this is the formula that we were used. And what is gross rate of pay? All right, gross rate of pay is your basic salary plus fixed allowance, exclude overtime. Okay, anything that is not fixed. So if that person has a fixed transport allowance of $500 a month on top of his $3,000 basic salary, then the monthly gross salary is $3,500. Okay, you should use that to calculate the incomplete month salary and not just using 3,000. The other formula that you need to know is the basic daily rate, how to get the daily rate. Most of us are now paid on a monthly basis. Now we don't get paid on daily or weekly. All our salary are on monthly basis. So from there, we need to calculate what is the daily rate or hourly rate. Then we have to use this formula. Monthly basic salary times 12 divided by the average number of working days per week times 52. Okay. So this will give you the daily rate. So if you work on a fixed 5 days work week, then it's 5 times 52 is 260. If you are working 5.5 days, half day Saturday, then it is 5.5 times 52 But if your weeks, certain weeks is 5 days, certain weeks is 5.5 for those who work on alternate Saturday, then you take the average in that month. Okay. So that would be 5.25 times 52. And of course, to get the hourly rate, then you, from your daily rate, you divide by the numbers of hours you work in a day. So for most of us, if you work 8 hours, then your daily rate divided by 8, you will get the hourly rate. For those who work a fixed 44 work week, then to get the hourly rate, it is the monthly basic salary times 12 divided by 2288 hours. So that's the total working hours you work a year based on 44 hours. So this formula is used to calculate, especially we want to get your hourly rate, to calculate your overtime. So for those people who are eligible for overtime payment, we need to know what is their hourly rate. And you have to use the right formula. You don't use the gross salary, you use the basic salary. And basic salary here refer to only your basic salary, excluding any fixed allowance. So please make sure you use the right formula to calculate the right thing. So there is a question, do we use the gross rate of pay formula to calculate the encashment of leave earned? Yes, okay. So that is the formula that you use. And there was another question that people asked, does annual leave entitlement starts from the first day of employment, including the probation period? Well, that should be asked during the Employment Act by MENA, but anyway, the answer is yes. Annual leave should start from the day of commencement of employment. So for overtime, okay, please take note, if you work overtime at your own request, okay, that means the employer, the company did not request you to do overtime, but you take the initiative to do extra. The company don't pay you the extra overtime. Okay, so if you work on a normal day, extra hours, you only get 1 time. But if the employer requests you or approve your leave, your overtime, then they have to pay you 1.5 times. Off day, at your own request is 1 time, employer 1.5. Rest day, at your own request, 1, at the employer is 2. If you come back on a holiday on your own, employer don't need to pay you. But if the employer requests, it's 1 time. Okay, so make sure when you do overtime as an employee, you get your employer to approve your overtime. If you don't do so, the employer can say, I did not request you to do OT, so therefore I don't need to pay you extra. All right. So for employer, HR, make sure that your employee, when they do overtime, must be approved so that you will pay them extra. Right. So, but what is the difference between off day and rest day? Okay. So for those people who work 5 days work week, there will be a 1 day rest day and a 1 day off day. Of course, for those who work a typical week, Monday to Sunday, then Sunday is usually considered as a rest day and Saturday an off day. But of course, in certain industry, the off day and the rest day may not be Saturday and Sunday. Okay? It depends on the scheduling. So certain off day can be a Monday, certain rest day can be a Friday or Thursday, and differ from week to week, depending how the managers schedule the employees to work. All right. So If your rest day is not fixed on a Sunday, then when you schedule an employee with different rest day throughout the week, please specify which is the rest day and which is off day, because if you don't, then the employee can say that day is my rest day and you pay me 2 times, not 1.5. So when you do scheduling, be very clear, specify which is the off day, which is the rest day for an employee if they only work 5 days. Now for public holiday, why is it only 1 time? I thought it should be 2 times. A lot of people tell me, hey, if you work one holiday, you get 2 times. Well, our monthly salary is already included the holiday pay. All right, so there's no need to pay extra. So if you work on a holiday, you just get an extra 1 day pay. If you don't pay that extra 1 day, you can always substitute, replace the holiday with another day. All right, you don't have to pay double. So that's why when you tell people your overtime on holiday, don't say your overtime on holiday is 2 times. You are wrong. All right. So please take note. Holiday pay, overtime for holiday is only 1 time because the holiday pay is already included in your monthly salary. Now I have another calculation exercise. All right. When an employee is on 1 day no pay leave, which formula should we use? Is it the gross rate of pay or is it the basic rate of pay? Okay. Question number 2, when we need to pay the balance unconsumed annual leave when an employee resigns, which formula should we use? Okay, just now I have given the answer. So for those of you who are alert, you will know. Someone was asking me this question when I was talking about the formula. Okay. When an employee is late for 1 hour on a work day, which formula should we use for deduction? All right. Well, let's go through the answer. Let's see if you got it correct. So for the first question, it should be the gross rate of pay or incomplete month. You should use the incomplete month to calculate. That is using the gross rate of pay, okay, divided by the number of days in that month, okay, times the number of days the person worked. Okay. And then that is the one. So if that month has 22 working days and he absent 1 day, take 1 day no pay leave, then it should be his gross salary times 22, divide by 22 times 21. Okay. So I repeat, if he's on 1 day no pay leave, you take his gross salary divided by 22 working days in that month, then times 21 working days that he worked. If he needs to calculate the unconsumed leave, you use the gross rate of pay again. All right. And then for the working hours late for 1 day, 1 hour, you use the basic rate. Calculate what is this hourly rate. All right. So When an employees look at this, let's open for discussion. Look at this work employee schedule, okay? Please take note, okay? Some employees do not work on a fixed Monday to Friday or Saturday. They have their rest day scheduled for them on different day of the week, especially in the retail, in the F&B, okay, in construction and so forth. So let's assume Sunday is a public holiday and the employee has to work on that day. It's his working day. Is he entitled to a public holiday? And if the public holiday fall on a Sunday, as you all know, Monday is usually an off day. Okay, it's by law. Once a holiday fall on Sunday, the public holiday will be, the Monday will be off. So does he get another day off if he works on Monday? So just imagine, okay, this coming Labor Day is going to be on a Sunday. Okay. So if Sunday is not his rest day and it's a public holiday and he works on it, the company has to pay holiday pay or replace 1 day off in due to this person. Okay. Right. For the rest of the people, there is no need to pay or replace. For those who have a rest day on Sunday, you don't have to pay holiday pay or replace. But for those who are working, you don't have to pay. For those who are working, then you have to pay the holiday pay or replace 1 day off. And same goes with Monday. If he comes back to work on Monday as usual, the company has to replace another day. Okay. So please take note. So there was a question by someone, okay, that an employee who has to give 1 week notice and he resigned on the 25th of April, his last day will be 1st May. And 1st May happens to be a Sunday. Okay. What happened? Well, as your company, if your company is working on a 5 days work week, okay, then his last day will be on Friday, 29th of April, officially. So the company pays him the full month of April, the whole full month. There is no need to pay him on the Monday or replace his another day because the holiday pay is already is in May. All right. So, and it's a Sunday. All right. So there's no need for you to pay him. Because his last working day is 29. So sometime when you put your notice period, okay, when you say 1 week, when we talk about 1 week, you are referring usually to the working days of the company, 5 working days. It's not 7 calendar days. This is usually the case. When we talk, you have to give 1 week notice, 2 week notice. We are referring to the working days. All right, so please take note, there are some payments that are subject to CPF and income tax. So as payroll staff, okay, people who handle payroll, you need to know what are the payments that are subject to CPF and what are the payments that are subject to tax. All right. So for example, payment in lieu of annual leave, your encashment of annual leave is subject to CPF and is also subject to tax. On the other hand, salary in lieu of notice, if someone resigns and the company does not need him to serve and pay off his notice period, then that payment is not subject to CPF, but is subject to tax. Okay. Retrenchment benefits is not subject to CPF and is also not subject to tax. Per diem for business trip is subject to CPF and may not be subject to tax depending on the amount. If the amount is huge, then it will be subject to income tax. If the amount is within what is recommended in the tax appendix, then it's not subject to tax. Long service, if you are giving long service award 5, 10, 15, 20 years, every interval of 5 years, then it is not subject to CPF, but subject to tax. But if you give long service for 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, then it's subject to CPF and it's subject to tax. And many companies, SME, likes to give festive gift. Especially during Chinese New Year, they'll give away ang pao. Some can be as much as $100, $200. These are all subject to CPF and tax. So there is a long list of items of payment that is subject to CPF. You can find this in the CPF website. And for tax, you can also find it in the tax portal. So go and take a look at the type of payment that is subject to CPF and subject to tax. Download it and keep it with you so that in case when your company makes such payment, you will know whether you are subject to CPF or subject to tax. The worst thing is that when it's subject to CPF and you don't pay CPF on it, the employees may take legal action against you or complaints against the company with the authority. Or the tax department may come after you if you do not pay tax on certain payment to the employee. Okay. So please do not violate the law because the penalty could be quite heavy if you make a mistake or you avoid paying CPF or avoid paying tax. So please take note and read the website. Salary deduction, okay. Please take note, there are certain things that you can deduct from an employee's salary, not everything. So absent from work, if the person is absent, yes, you can deduct the salary. There is no cap. Damage or loss of goods or money, the company can deduct, but the maximum deduction per month is 25%. So if let's say I lost my laptop or I lost the company mobile phone, which costs $1,000, all right, and my salary is only $3,000 a month. So the company cannot deduct 1,000 from my salary because that will be about 34%, more than the 25%. So in that case, the company may have to deduct over 2 deduction over 2 months to recover. Recover of loans and advance, also the same, is capped at 25% of monthly salary. Deduction of income tax, no cap. So this is usually the case where you have foreign worker, and sometimes you may have to deduct their salary and pay direct to IRAS. Please take note, the maximum amount of all deduction is 50% of the monthly salary, except if the person resigns and the salary is the last salary, then you can exceed the 50%. So all these deduction and payment can be found in MOM website. You also need to take a look and understand about that before you make any mistake. So before I continue, I'm opening to the floor. Any question from anyone? If you have any question, you can unmute yourself and raise the question. If not, you can put it in the Q&A. So for you who are handling payroll, please read up the Employment Act. Go and look into the CPF website portal and look at what are the contribution, what is the rate for the different age, different category of employees, the Singaporean, the PR, and what is ordinary wages, what is additional wages, etc. You need to know the term. Don't just rely on the system. Okay, if there's no question, then I will move on to the next session, which is about payday, payslip, and submission. Please take note that the employer has to pay salary to all the employees within 7 days after the end of a salary period. So what is a salary period? Okay. For most of us, the salary paid, we are paid on a monthly basis. So our salary period is 1 month. So what is your 1 month? Your employer has to specify. Is your 1 month 1st to 30th of the month or 31st of the month? Or is it 16th of the month to the next 15th of the month? Okay. Mid-month to mid-month. So what is your salary period? Your employer has to specify that. Okay. So most of us, or in fact all of us, I believe, our salary period is from 1st to the 30th or 31st of the month. And for overtime work, okay, the overtime payment has to be paid within 14 days after the end of a salary period. So sometimes you don't have to rush and try to pay the overtime on the last few days of the month within the same month. You can pay the following month. Okay. So as long as you make it clear to the employee where is the cutoff period for the overtime. So as I mentioned, a salary period is the period in which the salary that you earn is payable. And most of us is 1 month. Okay. And under the Employment Act, the salary period must not exceed 1 month. If it exceeds 1 month, then it means that the employer has delayed your salary. There are certain payments that of salary has to be paid differently, especially when the employee resigns with notice, then his salary has to be paid on the last day of service. So just now when we mentioned, there was a guy who tendered his resignation and gave 1 week notice, and his last day is on 1st May, but 1st May happens to be a Sunday, so his last working day is 29. He has to get his salary, last salary, on the 29th of April. Right. So on the last day. If an employee resigns without notice, without giving notice, then within 7 days after the last day of service. For termination of employee by the employer or dismissal of employee by the employer, it will be the last day of service. If it's not possible, within 3 days after the last day of service. This payday is only applicable to local employees. For foreign employees, it depends on the tax clearance. As long as the tax is cleared before the last day, then you can pay accordingly. If not, you have to wait until you receive notification from the income tax that the foreign worker has cleared his tax. You should not release a foreign worker's salary without clearing his tax. If not, the company will be responsible for any of his tax. Of course, sometimes people may ask, hey, when a person resigns, let's say mid-month, must we pay him on the last day of his service? Can we not pay together with all the other employees on the payday? Because sometimes it's quite difficult to just run the payroll for one person. And imagine if you are a large company with a few hundreds employees, few thousand employees, and every day you have people resigning. And every day you're running payroll, just for one person, 2 person. So what happened then? Well, you can always negotiate with the employees, all right? To check with them whether they accept to receive their salary on the normal payday with the other employees for ease of administration. And if they agree, fine. If they don't agree, then I'm sorry, you have to run a payroll for that person, right? But most of the time, if you handle it properly and handle it well, most employees will agree, no problem, you can pay me on a payday. I'm willing to wait just a few more days, all right, and so forth. So talk to the employee. Sometimes you can pay them on payday, but make sure you get it in writing, the agreement. So make sure you prepare a letter to say that your company accepts his resignation, and also both parties agree that the salary will be paid on the payday of that month, and both parties sign off, then it's covered. Okay, as long as there's both parties agreement, and it's in black and white, the law is okay. The law will not punish the employer for not paying on the last day. Sorry, I missed one question. There was a question whether should we put a salary period in the employee handbook? Well, it's good to put it in the employee handbook what is your salary period. But if you do not put it in, most people will know, okay? Because in your pay slip, you will put down that the salary is for which period. There's a salary period in the pay slip. The salary is from the month of January, from 1st January to 31st January, or from 1st April to 30th April. So in your pay slip, there will be indication of the salary period. So people will know. Okay. So, but of course, most employees do not know. Okay. They thought, oh, this salary is for this, for the period of this. And they do not know that period is actually a salary period. So if they ask, you can always explain to them that you can find the definition of salary period in the payslip, the period that was specified. Of course, under the Employment Act now, okay, all companies has to issue payslip to the employee. And in the payslip, you have to mention the salary period. This salary is for what, for what period, from when to when. So is it from 1st to 30th of April? Or if the person resigns somewhere around 28th of April, then it's 1st to 28th of April, and that is a salary period. Payday, when is he going to get his salary? That means when will be the salary be credited into the bank account? The basic salary, the payment, all the allowances, all the deduction, and what is the net salary. Of course, some companies goes beyond that. They do include year-to-date salary, year-to-date contribution. So contribution, CPF contribution is where? How come the payslip item don't show CPF contribution? CPF contribution is considered a deduction. All right. So employee CPF deduction is under deduction. Then the employer CPF contribution is below the line. So please make sure that all employees get a payslip. Of course, you can issue the payslip, or you can give a soft copy. Today, we don't issue payslip. Most companies, we try to save the environment. So we usually use a soft copy. There are certain things you have to do on a monthly basis. And what are the submissions that you need to do? CPF. So make sure that after your payday, do not forget to submit your CPF. You have 14 days to submit. Okay. So if your salary ends at the month, end of the month, then you have 14 days. Same in your CPF submission, you will include your foreign worker levy, your self-help group fund submission. And what is that? Self-help group fund refers to your SINDA, your CDAC, your Muslim fund, your Eurasian fund, and so forth. The four self-help group fund. And then your skill development levy, SDL, your income tax. These are ad hoc submission or on an annual basis. Of course, then you have the NS makeup pay on an ad hoc basis if you have people going on reservists. And you have to do that through the NS portal. All right. Again, for NS, you must know how to calculate the salary for those people going on NS. Please take note the period that they go for NS, the salary is paid by the government, but you still have to continue to contribute the CPF. for him on the full salary. So for CPF contribution, okay, we need to take note what is ordinary wage, which is the wages that you receive consistently on a monthly basis, like your basic salary. And the ordinary wages is capped at 6,000 per month at this moment. So if your salary, your basic salary is more than 6,000, we still use 6,000 to calculate your CPF contribution for both employee and employer. For additional wages, these are money received on an ad hoc basis, such as your bonus, your encashment of leave, okay, or certain incentive that you received. Those are considered as additional wages, and it's capped at 102,000 less the annual ordinary wages contribution. Okay. So all this can be found in the CPF website. Okay. And if you are using a payroll system, you must know how to input this in the parameter. So I mentioned just now about the self-help group. Okay. Please take note, okay, that the eligibility is very important. You need to be very clear. For CDAC, is eligible for all Singaporean and Singapore PR who are Chinese by race. All right. The MBMF, okay, the Muslim Fund, is all Muslim who are Singapore citizen, Singapore PR, foreign worker on work permit, S-Pass or EP. So please take note. The Muslim Fund applies to all employees, whether they are Singaporean or foreigner. Whereas the CDAC and Eurasian Fund is only Singaporean and PR. Okay. For Indian, SINDA, Singaporean PR and foreign employees and EPs. Only on EPs. PR, foreign worker on work permit and S-Pass, they don't have to contribute to SINDA. Only those on EP, employment pass. So the eligibility is very important. So what happens if you have an employee who's an Indian Muslim? So which fund should he contribute to or she contribute? Okay. Is it SINDA or is it Muslim? What do you all think? All right. So please take note. A lot of people, when it comes to this self-help group, a lot of them think it's only for Singaporean and PR. Please take note. For the Muslim, it includes all employees. So I know there are people who don't contribute to the Muslim fund for the foreigner. Okay, so then that is wrong. And for SINDA, make sure those foreigners on EP, you need to deduct and contribute to SINDA. So for the question, Indian Muslim, which fund? Well, the answer is, okay, depending on his choice, okay? So by right, he has to contribute to the Muslim, okay? That is compulsory. He's a Muslim, so he needs to contribute to the Muslim fund. But for SINDA, okay, he has a choice. He can continue to contribute as an Indian, or he can ask to cease that. Right? So he can apply for opt-out. So this self-help group, you can opt out. Okay, it does. If you do not take any option, you are in. It's compulsory. But if you do not want to contribute, you can opt out. You have to get a form submitting on to the self-help group to opt out. There are also some employees who contribute more than what is required. So those are voluntary contribution. So I know of some Muslim, instead of contributing to the normal rate, maybe for example, $5, they contribute $10 a month. They are allowed as long as they submit their application of voluntary contribution to the self-help group and is approved. We will have to contribute whatever they want. So please take note. So online submission, okay, for CPF, foreign worker, self-help group, SDL, you can submit this through the CPF portal. And there is a thing called CPF Easy Pay that you can use to do your submission. And then the deduction of the contribution will be deducted to your company bank account. Right. So there is no need to fill in forms and bring it down with a check to CPF to submit. So everything is done online. So for those who are using payroll software or system, you can generate the prescribed file and download it or upload it into the Easy Pay file, and then you can submit that instead of filling in. Same goes with the income tax. Okay, most companies by now should be under the auto inclusion. So every year end, the company will do the submission of your IRAS. All right, and employees will just have to fill their IRAS on the tax portal. There is no need to give a physical IRAS to the employees anymore. If they need a copy, they can go to the My Tax portal and download one copy. For NS backup pay, okay, you have to go to the NS portal and go to Manage NS Man Payment to submit your NS backup pay. Okay, so that's basically on payment and submission. Any question? If not, let's go for a quick exercise. There are 3 exercises now that I need you all to do. Okay, take out your calculator and start calculating. Okay, so of course you say, oh, now I have payroll system. I just have to input and the system will tell me how much. Yes, the system come up with a figure. You need to check whether it's right or wrong. So therefore, you need to know how to calculate. So for first question, okay, I already given you for the month of January this year, there are 21 working days. All right, and this person is below 55 years old, so the CPF is 20% for employee. Okay. Employer is 17%. So make sure when after you calculate your salary, you have to minus off 17%. So let's have a quick calculation and see what's the result. How many get the right? Remember, which formula should you use? Gross rate of pay or basic rate of pay? Do we have the answer? Let's see the results. Well, the correct answer, most of you got it right, is 1,828. So for those who got the first answer, put in the first answer, please remember you need to deduct off the CPF 17%. All right. So now same thing happened, same situation, person resigned. And this person now has 5 days annual leave balance and consumed annual leave. And you need to pay him these 5 days. So the only difference is that he has 5 days annual leave balance. So now, which is the correct answer? Again, please give me the answer, the net salary after deduction of CPF 17%. These are very common, and as a payroll person, you must be able to calculate and check and make sure that the system generate the right answer for you. If you have input the right formula in the system, the answer should be correct. Let's see the results. How many got it right? Well, good, almost. Okay, all of you got it right except one who still says at first, which is not correct. You need to deduct off the CPF again. 3692 is before deduction of CPF. You need to deduct off the employee CPF and you will get 2009. Okay. Now, the last exercise. This time, there is no leave balance, but this guy has taken 2 days of no pay leave in that month. Okay. 2 days of no pay leave. Okay. So same thing happens. This time, he has taken 2 days no pay leave. Again, calculate his net salary, that is after deducting the CPF. You need to deduct off the CPF of 17%. Hopefully this time everybody got it right. So can you remember January, how many working days? 21. So let's see what's the answer. Well, good. Everybody got it right now, okay? 2,171.29. Very well done, everyone. Give yourself a big round of applause. So now you know, these are very typical situation for payroll. And it is important that you check what the system has computed to make sure that it is right. Now, there are also questions that was posed to me before this webinar to ask, which is the best payroll system? Well, unfortunately, I'm able to tell you there are a lot of payroll systems in Singapore, a lot of payroll vendors. Okay, each has its own strengths and weaknesses. But typically, an important consideration when you look at payroll system, you have to ensure that all their parameters, whatever they do, is in compliance with all the legal regulation. All right. And the payroll system must allow you to set up codes and parameters, the rules very easily. Put in the formulas and so forth. And the payroll system must allow you to process your payroll either on a monthly basis, ad hoc basis, or additional payroll run. It must have that kind of flexibility. There are certain payroll system only can do one payroll run a month. That may not be good. What happened, like I said, you have someone who resigned and need his salary immediately. And that payroll system cannot run his salary, and you have to do it manually. Then what's the point of having that payroll system? So a payroll system must allow you to run not only your monthly payroll run, but also on an ad hoc basis. Your payroll system must also allow you to do direct transfer, to download a file that you can upload to the CPF portal, the tax portal, or to the bank. Okay. So your payroll system must also be able to produce the IRA in the format required by the income tax department and submit online to the tax department. Payroll system must also be allowed you to generate various reports. Payroll summary report of the whole company, of all the employees, by department. They must also help you to produce your bank listing, your CPF listing, for those that are paid by check, okay, and also variance report, etc. So your payroll system must allow you to create various kind of report. The payroll system must also be able to produce pay slip and send it to the employees where they can view it on their mobile phone. If they have a mobile phone application, all right, without having to print it out. And also your payroll system must be able to interface with other HR modules like leave and attendance, as well as the finance system. So for example, if someone apply no pay leave on your leave system, when you do a payroll run at the end of the month, you just click an interface and whatever no pay leave, whoever taken it, will be registered in the payroll system and deduction will be made. Same go with attendance. If someone who absent or who works extra hours, this will be captured as overtime or deduction, and when they do the interface, and the payroll will then do the auto calculation without you having to input. So a good payroll system must have all these kind of features that helps the payroll person to save time, but that doesn't mean the payroll person don't check. Still need to check through to make sure that everything that is produced is correct and accurate. So if you came to ask me which is a payroll system, I'm afraid I cannot tell you at this moment. Every system is good depending on how you use it. It's very subjective. Okay. Some people prefer to have a lot of features, thereby making the system a little bit complicated and complex. Some people like it simple, straightforward, with less features. And user-friendly. So depending on the requirements of the person. Okay. But what is important is that the payroll system must comply with regulation, and it's good to make sure that the payroll systems are able to link to various HR module, finance system, and able to let employees view their payslip on their mobile phone. These are some of the minimum required features. Well, how we can help you? Well, as you know that I mentioned earlier that NuSmart, we do HR consulting, we have payroll outsourcing services. So, and we also have our HRMS. You can always call upon us to look at our HRMS, or if you want to outsource your payroll to us, please give us a call. And why do people want to outsource their payroll? It's very common nowadays. One is due to lack of resources. As you know, HR now are very thin, a very thin, small department. We don't have the luxury of having 3-4 people. Most of the time it's 1 people, 2 people. And sometimes we are overloaded with work. And it's good to outsource the payroll, which is very maintained, very administrative, to someone else who are expert, who can then do the work for you, okay, and then check for you. All you have to do is do a quick review, and once everything is okay, just sign off. So when you outsource payroll, you know that you are in safe hand because the person on the other hand is a subject matter expert. There's always contact point between the person and the HR person in the company. They have client support. They have good system, okay, payroll system that you can leverage on, so you don't have to pay extra. Okay. And they will always ensure that, okay, if there's any changes to the law, to the CPF rate, or to any of the regulation, it will be updated in the system. You don't have to worry. So all these are advantages for you to outsource a payroll, which is now getting more and more common. So for payroll outsourcing, we have the monthly services that do all your monthly payroll run. And then we have the annual service to produce your IRA for your annual submission, or for those ad hoc services like taking NS pay or maternity claims, and so forth. So do call on us if you need your payroll to be outsourced, or if you need a payroll system, you can always reach out to NuSmart, and we will definitely contact you and discuss on your requirements. So to let you know, we do have another webinar next month on 15th of June, where I will be talking about getting compensation right. Now, we talk about payroll. Now, the next important thing is we are going to talk about salary compensation. How should we compensate our people? What kind of incentive can we give to our people to reward them, to motivate them, to retain them? So salary is very important to an employee, and we have to make sure that we pay them right. Of course, there are some companies who go above and pay above market, and then at the end of the day, they may end up suffering because the wage cost is too high. Okay. So making sure that the payment of salary must be correct. So do remember this date, 15th of June. We are going to start with 2 new initiatives. One is called HR Clinic Session, free. So it's a 1-hour session. We're going to have it maybe once every fortnight, where we will open up a Zoom session for any of you to join and raise your question, raise your issues or problems, and I will try to help provide some solution, how you can handle that issue, resolve that issue. So it's going to be online, free clinic for those who do not have a strong HR head and need help. Do join our HR clinics, and you can throw in whatever question you have or whatever doubts you have. I will help you. We can discuss about it, okay, and how to get that done. I will also be publishing HR leading practices. So many of us have gone through HR training. We read a lot of HR books. Okay, they give us a lot of theories that we need to do this, we need to do that, but never tell us how to do it. Okay, so it is important, okay, that you not only know what to do, but you must also know how to do it. And these leading practices will tell you how to do it. So I will give you some tools, some examples, some forms, some templates for you to use. Okay, so if you are doing employment contract, I will give you a sample of what is a good employment contract, or that you can use, or contract for service, okay, where you can download and take it as a sample for you to use. So you don't need to crack your head to draft out your own contract. Or if I talk about recruitment or interviewing, I may tell you some interviewing questions based on STAR method, competency-based, that you can use. Okay, so actual questions that you can use to ask the candidate. Right? Or some interview assessment form that you can use, or job description form, things like that. So there are many things that will be talked on in these leading HR practices. Okay? So I'll cover many areas. So please stay tuned. I will also continue my one-day in-depth employment act. So this is very important for HR people and also for those who are doing payroll. As I can see, even from today, there are still a lot of questions asked that is in relation to Employment Act. So for those of you who still have doubt about the employment, okay, situation, how to handle, come and attend this Employment Act course. Okay. We have started it last month, and the response was good. The comments from the participant was very good. Okay. You get a lot of experience sharing. I will go through the whole Employment Act, and I'll share my experience, how you handle certain situations, certain case. So there will be exercises for you to do, case study, and so forth. So this will help you to be more competent and more knowledgeable about the Employment Act. And this will help you to handle your HR better. So do join us in this one-day in-depth Employment Act course, which will be on 19th of May. So these are some of my leading practices. Okay. So I will be covering on PDPA, succession planning. A lot of people talk about succession planning, and they just show organization chart, who succeed who, and then that's it. They call it succession planning. Hello, that's not succession planning. You need to put in place a development action plan. What is that? Okay. So these are very important. We talk about salary ranges. How do you how do you develop salary ranges? What is the spread? What is the compound ratio? So these are very important. So please look up. Because most books doesn't show you how to do it, but they just tell you these are good practices to have. Okay. So please stay connect with us. We have various sites for you to connect. Right. So do connect with us. And if you still have any question, feel free to write in to us on our email. All right, so that's the end of my session. I'm going to open up for final question and answer. If you have.
It looks like everyone has already asked their questions. But if anyone has questions, feel free to just drop us a message or come for our free clinics that we have. So thanks everyone again who have joined us for today's session this afternoon. Sorry we overran. It has been an information-packed session. Thanks a lot, Maurice, for this very insightful session again. And we hope that everyone has taken away very useful tips that you can use right away. Do chat with us if you need any help. I've left my email also in the chat if you want to reach out for any HR related matters. We hope to see you again at our future webinars or the clinic sessions or in any other way. There's a survey at the end of the session as well. And we have also launched a poll. So do let us know about what you think about this webinar, and also if you'd like to join for our course, or if you are interested in any of our HR services. And also, once again, thanks everyone for joining us. Hope you have a good day.
Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.
Maurice?
Yeah.
I think someone raised hand. Is it?
Chat. No.
Oh, she left.
Just say thank you.
Accidentally, she raised hand.
Raise hand, I cannot see.
Oh, right. You cannot see. I can see.
I only can see chat and question.